Jack Thompson, an 86-year-old black veteran, stepped into the bustling Oakside Eatery for what he thought would be a peaceful Sunday breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but what happened next would shatter any sense of tranquility. The restaurant's owner, a man known for his charm and smile, approached Jack with an expression that hinted at anything but kindness. What unfolded next will shock you. A single act of prejudice in this small southern town of Oak Ridge would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Keep watching to see how one man's dignity, a surprising group of allies, and a community divided would change everything. Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you find this story powerful, don't forget to like and share it. Your support means the world. Jack Thompson, 86 years old and full of quiet strength, woke up with the first rays of the morning sun streaming through his window. His routine was simple, yet comforting. Splash cold water on his face, shave the whiskers that had stubbornly sprouted overnight, and neatly press his favorite shirt. Today was Sunday, his favorite day of the week, the day he treated himself to breakfast out. Jack's weathered hands, a testament to a life of hard work and service, carefully buttoned his shirt as he glanced at the medals hanging in their display case nearby. Each ribbon and badge told a story, stories of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to his country. But while his military uniform once commanded respect, Jack had spent a lifetime learning that respect wasn't always freely given, especially in a town like Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was the kind of southern town you'd see on postcards. The cobblestone streets, flower-filled window boxes, and friendly shopkeepers gave it a picture-perfect charm. But beneath the surface, unspoken tensions ran deep. Jack had lived here his entire life and knew those tensions well. He'd grown used to the subtle stares, the murmurs that followed him when he walked into certain establishments, and the polite yet cold smiles from those who thought he didn't belong. For years, Jack had been a loyal customer of Rosie's Diner, a small family-owned spot where he felt welcome. The waitresses there greeted him by name, and the cook always knew just how he liked his eggs. But that morning, a handwritten sign on Rosie's door read, "Closed for renovations. See you soon." Jack sighed, standing in front of the locked door for a moment before deciding to try someplace new. He'd heard people in town talk about Oakside Eatery. Known for its cozy atmosphere and hearty meals, it had recently become the go-to spot for locals. Jack figured he'd give it a try. After all, it was just breakfast. How different could it be? As he strolled through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, Jack couldn't help but notice the faint whispers and glances from passers-by. A group of teenagers huddled near the corner store fell silent as he walked by, their hushed tones making his ears burn. An elderly couple across the street paused their conversation to glance his way before quickly looking down. Jack straightened his shoulders and kept his head high, a habit he'd developed during his years in the military. He was no stranger to these moments, but they still left a bitter taste. He wondered, as he often did, if the sacrifices he'd made for his country were ever truly appreciated by some of the very people he had fought to protect. The Oakside Eatery came into view, its sign swinging gently in the breeze. Oakside Eatery, where everyone's welcome. Jack let out a small chuckle at the irony, hoping the sentiment on the sign would hold true inside. The restaurant itself was charming. Wooden benches flanked by flower pots, large windows letting in the morning light, and the low hum of conversation spilling out into the street. Jack took a deep breath and stepped inside. The warm scents of cinnamon pancakes and freshly brewed coffee greeted him, momentarily easing the tension in his chest. Families crowded the booths, their children giggling over syrupy plates. Couples sipped coffee, leaning in close to whisper. A few solo diners sat at the counter, lost in their newspapers. Jack paused near the entrance, his gaze sweeping the room. For a moment, he felt like any other customer, ready to enjoy a simple breakfast. But then his eyes met those of a man standing behind the counter, a tall figure with a stiff posture and piercing gaze. Jack didn't know it yet, but this man was Max Porter, the owner of Oakside Eatery, and their paths were about to collide in a way that would change everything. Would this new restaurant live up to its welcoming promise? Or would Jack find himself facing yet another battle, this time not on the battlefield but at the breakfast table? Keep watching to see how this quiet morning would turn into an unforgettable confrontation. Jack stepped further into the Oakside Eatery, the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes blending into a comforting rhythm. The space had a welcoming charm: polished wooden floors, soft yellow lights, and walls adorned with black and white photos of Oak Ridge's history. He took in the inviting atmosphere, his eyes settling on a corner table near the window. A perfect spot to enjoy the morning sun, he thought. A young hostess approached him, her name tag reading Lily. She greeted him with a bright smile that seemed genuine. "Good morning, sir. Just one today?" Jack nodded politely. "Yes, just me." "Right this way," she said, leading him to the table by the window. As he followed her, Jack caught snippets of nearby conversations: families discussing church plans, friends laughing over inside jokes. It reminded him of Sundays long ago, when life felt simpler and the world seemed kinder. Lily placed a menu in front of him. "I'll bring some water to get you started. Let me know if you need anything." "Thank you," Jack replied, his voice steady but warm. He appreciated her professionalism, though he noticed a slight hesitation in her tone, almost as if she were nervous. He dismissed it, chalking it up to the busy morning rush. Jack settled into his seat, the soft creak of the chair grounding him in the moment. For a brief time, he let himself relax, scanning the menu filled with hearty breakfast options. His stomach growled at the description of fluffy pancakes and crispy bacon. He smiled faintly, imagining Rosie at her diner teasing him about trying something new. As Jack waited, he began to notice subtle shifts in the room's energy. A man sitting a few tables away glanced over at him, then quickly looked down at his plate. A group near the counter grew quieter, their conversation trailing off when their eyes flicked in his direction. Jack's instincts, honed through years of navigating similar situations, told him these weren't just casual glances. The warmth of the restaurant's ambiance now felt laced with an undercurrent of unease. A waitress passed by, her tray piled high with plates. She shot Jack a quick smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. He could feel it, the slight stiffness in her movements, the way she avoided looking at him too long. These were moments he had experienced too often in his life, subtle reminders that not everyone saw him as just another customer. Jack straightened his posture, his military training kicking in. He had learned long ago how to command respect without saying a word. Still, he hoped this was just his imagination playing tricks on him, that the unease he felt was nothing more than the echoes of old memories. As he turned back to the menu, Jack sensed a figure approaching his table. He looked up to see a tall man in his 40s with sharp features and a perfectly pressed apron. His name tag read Max Porter. Max's expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning Jack with a mixture of curiosity and something Jack couldn't quite place. Without a word, Max stopped a few feet away, his presence looming. Max's gaze lingered on Jack for a moment too long, the corners of his mouth tugging into a tight, perfunctory smile. "Good morning," he said, his tone cordial but carrying an edge that didn't match his words. "I see Lily's got you all set up." Jack nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, she's been very kind. Thank you." Max's eyes narrowed slightly as though searching for something in Jack's demeanor that he couldn't quite find. Sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his words casual on the surface but unmistakably pointed. "We get a lot of regulars here. New faces always stand out." Jack met his gaze evenly, his voice steady but polite. "A friend recommended it. Thought I'd give it a try." The response seemed to catch Max off guard, though he recovered quickly, his smile tightening further. "Well, we're a bit busy today," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the restaurant. "Might take a while to get your order in." Jack glanced around, taking in the half-empty tables and servers moving at an unhurried pace. The hum of the room didn't match the urgency Max was implying. He turned back to Max, his expression calm but resolute. "That's fine. I'm in no rush." The simplicity of Jack's response seemed to unsettle Max further. His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment the carefully curated facade of hospitality cracked, revealing a flicker of irritation. "All right then," Max said curtly. "Enjoy your time." As Max walked away, Jack noticed Lily standing near the hostess stand, her hand gripping the edge of the podium. Her brows were furrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. When their eyes met, she quickly looked away, fiddling with the menus in front of her. Jack sighed inwardly, a familiar weariness settling over him. He'd seen this dynamic play out before, the quiet complicity of those who didn't agree but also didn't intervene. He had learned long ago not to take it personally, but it still stung in its own way. A few minutes passed, and Jack sat patiently at his table, occasionally glancing at the other diners. A waitress passed by with a tray of food, serving a couple who had arrived after him. Another server brought coffee to a table near the entrance. The promise of a long wait seemed reserved for him alone. Jack's stomach growled softly, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he adjusted his posture, sitting a little straighter, his eyes fixed on the bustling room around him. He could feel the subtle glances of other patrons, some curious, others indifferent, and a few unmistakably hostile. But Jack remained where he was, calm and steady. He'd faced far worse in his life than a chilly reception at a restaurant, and he wasn't about to let it deter him now. What was a breakfast compared to the battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and back home? Max, who had been hovering near the counter, glanced over and seemed surprised to see Jack still seated. His expression darkened briefly before he turned away, muttering something to one of the servers. The quiet tension in the air thickened, unnoticed by some but felt keenly by Jack. He adjusted the silverware on the table, a small, deliberate movement that helped ground him. He wasn't going anywhere. Jack sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the unease radiating from some of the patrons. A couple at the table closest to him kept their voices low, occasionally glancing his way before quickly looking down at their plates. A man sitting by the counter stared openly for a moment before pretending to be engrossed in his newspaper. Others, more subtle but just as telling, shifted in their seats or avoided looking in his direction altogether. It wasn't the first time Jack had been treated like this, and he doubted it would be the last. He'd lived long enough to recognize when he was being silently judged. Still, he remained composed, letting the faint smile on his face disguise the growing knot of frustration in his chest. Across the room, a group of men seated at a corner table caught Jack's attention. 4 of them, all clad in worn leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias, sat casually around the table, sipping coffee and eating. Their presence was unmistakable: broad shoulders, weathered faces, and an air of quiet confidence. At the head of the table sat Samuel "Sam" Davis, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and piercing eyes. He seemed to notice everything without appearing to look too closely. Though the group's rough appearance might have intimidated some, there was something steady and purposeful about the way they carried themselves. Jack's instincts told him they weren't here by chance. Sam leaned back in his chair, watching the room with an unreadable expression. When his gaze briefly met Jack's, he offered the faintest nod of acknowledgement before turning back to his companions. The exchange was brief, but it carried a weight Jack couldn't quite place. Jack returned his attention to his table, his stomach rumbling faintly. Nearly 20 minutes had passed, and still, no one had come to take his order. He glanced at Lily, who stood near the podium, visibly uncomfortable. Their eyes met again, and this time she seemed on the verge of saying something before Max appeared beside her. Max shot a glance in Jack's direction, his lips curling into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. With an exaggerated motion, he clapped his hands together, drawing the attention of some of the staff. He made his way toward Jack's table, his footsteps deliberate, his expression betraying none of the hostility Jack had sensed earlier. "Well," Max said as he reached Jack's table, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "Looks like we've got a bit of a mix-up here. You see, this is a busy morning for us, and, well, we're not really equipped to handle unexpected guests." Jack raised an eyebrow, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "I didn't realize breakfast reservations were required here." Max chuckled lightly, though the sound was hollow. "It's not that, exactly. But we do reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, as I'm sure you understand." The words hung in the air, unmistakable in their intent. The room fell noticeably quieter, conversations tapering off as patrons began to pay attention. Even the bikers at the corner table turned their focus toward the scene unfolding before them. Jack straightened in his seat, his gaze unwavering. "I understand my rights just fine. I also understand when I'm being told I don't belong." Max's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, tighter this time. Now, let's not make this into something it's not. I'm just saying we're full up today." Jack glanced around the room, noting the empty tables and the lack of urgency among the staff. "Doesn't seem full to me." The room seemed to hold its breath. Max's face reddened slightly, but he held his ground. "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable somewhere else," he said, his tone sharper now, the pretense of politeness slipping. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate and slow. The subtle shift caused a ripple of unease through the room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes were on him now, the air heavy with anticipation. Jack's hand emerged from his pocket, holding a worn leather wallet. With the same deliberate care, he opened it and slid out a card, his military ID, the edges frayed from decades of use but still intact, its lettering clear. He placed it on the table in front of him, the laminated plastic catching the light. "I served this country for 30 years, Jack said evenly, his voice low but carrying an undeniable strength. "I've fought for the freedoms we all enjoy. That includes the freedom to have a meal in any restaurant I choose." The room remained deathly quiet, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions flickering between shame and unease. Others averted their eyes entirely, as though pretending not to witness the moment would absolve them of any involvement. Max stared at the ID, his jaw tightening. His eyes flicked up to Jack's face, and for a moment it seemed as if he might relent. But instead of backing down, he leaned forward slightly, his lips curling into a sneer. "That's all well and good," Max said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But that doesn't change anything here. I don't care where you've been or what you've done. This is my establishment, and I get to decide who's welcome." Jack remained calm, his gaze steady. "And you've decided that a man who served his country doesn't deserve breakfast. That's quite a statement, Mr. Porter." Max's face reddened, the tension between them crackling like static electricity. He straightened, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm not going to sit here and let you twist this into something it's not. This isn't about what you did in the past. It's about now, and right now, I'm telling you that you're not welcome." From their corner table, Sam and his group exchanged knowing glances. Sam leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. Without a word, he tapped the table twice with his knuckles, a subtle signal that didn't go unnoticed by the men seated with him. They sat up straighter, their postures shifting in unison as though preparing for action. Lily, the hostess, lingered near the entrance, her eyes darting between Jack and Max. Her hands fidgeted with the stack of menus, her discomfort growing with every word Max spoke. Nearby, a waitress balanced a tray of dishes, her gaze fixed on the confrontation. The tension in the room seemed to pull her attention from her task, and her hands trembled slightly. Max stepped closer to Jack's table, his voice rising. "I don't care if you got every medal in the country. Your kind doesn't belong here." The waitress's hands gave way, and the tray of dishes tumbled to the floor with a resounding crash, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. The sound startled everyone, drawing gasps and sharp intakes of breath from the patrons. All eyes turned to the source of the noise, but the tension in the room remained unbroken, now thicker than ever. The sharp crash of the tray hitting the floor seemed to echo throughout the Oakside eatery, jolting everyone out of their stunned silence. Jack remained seated, calm and composed, his military ID still sitting on the table like a silent reminder of his service. Across the room, Sam and his group of bikers exchanged quick glances, their decision made without a single word spoken. Slowly, Sam pushed back his chair, the sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor cutting through the hushed atmosphere. The other bikers followed suit, each rising with a deliberate air, their presence commanding immediate attention. The room's energy shifted as heads turned toward the imposing group, their leather jackets and quiet intensity drawing every eye. Sam approached Jack's table, his stride measured but purposeful. Standing tall, his silver-streaked beard catching the light, he placed a steady hand on the back of the chair across from Jack. His voice, deep and calm, broke the tension like a knife slicing through fog. "Morning," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Name's Samuel Davis. Most folks call me Sam." Jack glanced up, meeting Sam's gaze. There was an unspoken understanding between the two men, a recognition of shared experiences. Jack gave a small nod, his expression unreadable but appreciative. Sam turned to Max, who had been frozen in place, his mouth slightly open as though caught off guard by the biker's sudden involvement. "And you must be the owner," Sam continued, his voice cool but sharp enough to cut through the air. "Max Porter, is it?" Max blinked, visibly collecting himself. "That's right," he said, his earlier bravado returning. "And this is my restaurant." Sam nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's so? Well, it seems to me there's a bit of a misunderstanding here." He gestured toward Jack's table. "This man, right here, he's a veteran, same as me, same as the men sitting back there, and I don't take kindly to the way you're treating him." Max's face hardened, his shoulders squaring as he crossed his arms. "With all due respect," he said, his tone now defensive, "this has nothing to do with you. This is my establishment, and I reserve the right to decide who I serve." Sam's lips twitched, almost as if he were suppressing a smile. "Funny thing about rights," he said evenly. "They go both ways. You got the right to run your business how you see fit, sure, but we've got the right to stand up against what's wrong. And make no mistake," his voice dropped slightly, a steel edge creeping in, "what you're doing here is wrong." The room seemed to hold its breath as Sam's words hung in the air. At the corner table where the bikers had been seated, the remaining men stood silently, their presence adding weight to Sam's argument. The tension was almost tangible now, the line between right and wrong drawn clearly in the sand. Some patrons murmured quietly, their reactions divided. A middle-aged woman near the entrance shook her head, muttering something under her breath before hastily gathering her things and leaving. A younger couple at the next table exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of unease and curiosity, while an older man seated at the counter gave a small nod of approval. Max, however, wasn't swayed. His face darkened, his voice rising. "You don't get to come in here and tell me how to run my business. I've been serving this town for years, and I don't need you or anyone else telling me who I can and can't serve." Sam took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Serving this town, huh? And yet you're standing here, refusing service to a man who's done more for this country than most ever will. A man who fought for your right to even own this place." He gestured toward Jack's ID on the table. "That card right there? That's earned. That's sacrifice. And you're going to throw it back in his face?" Max faltered for a moment, but the embers of his anger flared quickly. He straightened his back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I don't need a lecture from you," he snapped. "This is my place, and if you don't like it, you're welcome to leave." Sam's expression didn't change, his composure unshaken. "We're not going anywhere," he said simply, "and neither is he." The room grew even quieter, the divide among the patrons more evident now. Some watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Others whispered among themselves, their voices carrying varying tones of agreement or dissent. Lily, still stationed near the entrance, looked as though she might crumble under the weight of the moment, her hands gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. Max's face twisted into a scowl, his frustration bubbling over. "You know what?" he said, his voice sharp and triumphant, as though he'd just thought of a solution. "I'm done arguing. I'm calling the police. Let's see what they have to say about a group of bikers causing trouble in my restaurant." Without waiting for a response, Max turned sharply on his heel and stormed toward the back of the room, his hand already reaching for his phone. Max stormed into the back room, slamming the door behind him with enough force to make the walls tremble. The sound reverberated through the restaurant, drawing more eyes to Jack and the group of bikers now gathered around his table. Whispers began to ripple across the room as patrons exchanged hushed commentary, some shaking their heads while others simply looked on in disbelief. Sam remained standing by Jack's table, his arms crossed and his expression as calm as ever. The other bikers stayed near their corner table, their presence looming yet measured. Jack sat quietly, his military ID still on the table, his posture steady. Despite the growing tension, his demeanor reflected the discipline and patience that had carried him through far worse moments in his life. In less than 5 minutes, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens pierced the air. Heads turned toward the windows as the flashing red and blue lights of 2 patrol cars painted the restaurant's walls in streaks of color. The murmurs inside grew louder, some patrons looking uncomfortable while others leaned forward, eager to see how the situation would unfold. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles, their movements brisk and deliberate. The lead officer, a man in his late 40s with graying hair at his temples, adjusted his belt and gave a quick nod to his younger partner before heading toward the entrance. The younger officer, barely past his mid-20s, followed closely behind, his hand resting near his holster. The tension in the restaurant rose another notch as the door swung open, the bell above it jangling faintly. Max emerged from the back room just as the officers entered, his expression a mix of triumph and righteous indignation. He gestured toward Jack and the bikers, his voice raised just enough to ensure everyone could hear him. "Officers, right here. These are the people causing a disturbance in my restaurant." The lead officer raised a hand, signaling for calm as he scanned the room. His eyes briefly lingered on Jack, then shifted to Sam and his group before finally settling on Max. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. Max straightened his shoulders, eager to tell his side of the story. "This man," he said, pointing at Jack, "came in here uninvited and refused to leave when I asked him to, and these bikers," he waved a hand toward Sam and the others, "decided to start causing trouble, intimidating my staff and scaring off my customers. I had no choice but to call you." The officer's gaze flicked back to Jack, taking in his calm demeanor and the military ID still resting on the table. "Sir," the officer said, addressing Jack directly, "is that true? Were you asked to leave?" Jack met the officer's eyes, his voice steady as he replied. "He told me I wasn't welcome, said there wasn't any room, even though half the tables are empty. I just wanted to sit down and have breakfast like anyone else." Sam stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. "And we stepped in when we saw how he was treating this man," he added. "Jack here is a veteran, same as me and most of the guys at that table." He gestured toward his group. "We didn't raise our voices, didn't threaten anyone. We just made it clear that this kind of treatment isn't right." The younger officer glanced nervously at the bikers, his eyes darting between their leather jackets and the patches sewn into them. The lead officer, however, seemed more focused on Jack. His eyes dropped to the ID on the table, and his brow furrowed as if processing the weight of what he'd just been told. Max, sensing the tide turning against him, leaned forward and raised his voice. "Look, officer, it's my right as a business owner to refuse service to anyone. These people are disrupting my business, plain and simple. They're causing a scene, and I want them out." Before the officer could respond, A soft click echoed from the far side of the room. A young woman seated near the window was holding up her phone, its camera trained on the confrontation. The faint glow of her screen suggested she was live streaming the entire encounter. A man at a nearby table pulled out his own phone, angling it to capture the officers, Max and Jack, in the same frame. The lead officer noticed, his expression tightening as he realized the scene was now being recorded. He turned back to Jack, his voice measured. "Sir, can you tell me more about what happened?" Jack nodded, his voice calm but resolute. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I served my country for 3 decades, thinking I was fighting for a better future. All I wanted this morning was to enjoy a quiet meal, but when I walked in here I was told I didn't belong, that I wasn't welcome." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of lived experience. The officers exchanged glances, the younger one visibly uncertain, while the lead officer's expression remained carefully neutral. Sam stepped in again, his voice firmer now. "You see this?" He pointed to Jack's ID. "That's proof of service, proof of sacrifice. And this man," he gestured toward Max, "wants to act like it doesn't mean anything. That's the real disturbance here." Max, his face now flushed with anger, jabbed a finger toward Sam. "I don't care who he is or what he's done. This is my restaurant, and I decide who stays and who goes." The room erupted in whispers, some patrons visibly uncomfortable with Max's outburst. A few people shook their heads, while others murmured in agreement with him. The divide was palpable now, the line between supporters and detractors clearly drawn. The lead officer raised his hand again, silencing the room. He turned to Max, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I need you to calm down. Let me sort this out." Max crossed his arms, fuming but silent. The officer then turned back to Jack, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing his next words carefully. The younger officer glanced nervously at his partner, unsure of how this was going to play out. The room fell silent again, all eyes on the lead officer as he shifted his gaze to Max. The tension was electric, every patron holding their breath as they waited for his verdict. The lead officer stood tall, his gaze fixed on Max. The room was utterly silent, save for the occasional scrape of a chair or the low hum of the air conditioning. Jack sat calmly, his military ID still on the table, while Sam and the bikers stood steadfast around him. All eyes were on the officer, waiting for his decision. "Mr. Porter," the officer began, his voice steady and measured, "this is a public establishment. Under the law, as long as patrons are peaceful and abiding by the rules of your business, you have no grounds to remove them. From what I've seen and heard here today, there's no evidence that Mr. Thompson or these gentlemen have caused any disruption." Max's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. "But," he began, but the officer raised a hand to silence him. "I'm not finished," the officer said firmly. "As a veteran myself, I find it troubling that someone who served this country with honor is being treated this way. It's not right, and frankly, it's not the kind of behavior this community should stand for." Max's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The officer turned to Jack, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Thompson, you're welcome to stay and enjoy your meal. If you feel unsafe or uncomfortable at any point, let us know." Jack gave a small nod, his voice calm but resolute. "Thank you, officer." The officer then addressed Sam and his group. "Gentlemen, thank you for keeping this peaceful. It's clear you're here to stand up for what's right, and I respect that. Just make sure it stays that way." Sam gave a small salute. "Understood, officer. We're just here to support a fellow veteran." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. The lead officer nodded at his partner, and the two made their way toward the door. As they left, the older officer glanced back at Max one last time, his expression stern. "Mr. Porter, I suggest you think long and hard about how you handle situations like this in the future. The world's watching." As soon as the officers left, the restaurant buzzed with energy. Conversations erupted at tables, some hushed and others loud enough to carry across the room. A few patrons stood, shaking their heads in disgust as they grabbed their belongings and left. "This is unbelievable," a woman near the counter muttered as she threw on her coat. "Treating a veteran like that? I'll never set foot in this place again." Another man, however, remained seated, crossing his arms and glaring at Jack and the bikers. "It's his restaurant," he said loudly to no one in particular. "He has every right to decide who he serves." The divide was stark. Some customers left in protest, while others stayed, their faces etched with disapproval or quiet support for Max. The bikers, meanwhile, returned to their corner table, their presence a silent reminder that Jack wasn't alone. Jack remained seated, his composure unshaken. He watched as the chaos unfolded around him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one felt different, both heavier and strangely hopeful. For every hostile glance, there was a nod of support. For every angry whisper, there was a voice speaking up for what was right. Sam returned to Jack's side, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair across from him. "You okay, Jack?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Jack nodded. "I'm fine. Seen worse than this?" His eyes flicked to Max, who was standing near the counter, his face a mask of fury as he barked orders at the staff. "But I don't think he's going to let this go." Sam smirked faintly. "Let him stew. The truth's out now." And the truth was spreading fast. The young woman near the window was still live streaming, her phone held steady as she narrated the aftermath of the confrontation. "You all saw what just happened here," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "A veteran, an American hero, was told he didn't belong, and if it weren't for those bikers stepping in, who knows how this would have ended." Another patron was uploading a clip of the exchange, the title glaring on the screen. "Discrimination at Oakside Eatery. Veteran refused service." Within minutes, the videos began to gain traction, comments flooding in from viewers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. "This is disgusting. How can this still happen in 2024? Props to the bikers for standing up for him. Boycott Oakside Eatery. This behavior has no place in our communities." Back inside the restaurant, Max paced behind the counter, his face growing redder with every passing second. He glanced at his phone, which had started buzzing incessantly with notifications. The videos had reached local community groups, and people were already tagging the restaurant in angry posts. "Max," one of his waitresses whispered, her voice trembling, I think this is getting out of hand." "Quiet," Max snapped, slamming his hand on the counter. "I'll handle it." But, even as he said the words, the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers. The bell above the door jingled again, drawing everyone's attention. This time it wasn't the police or another customer, it was a young man in a pressed suit, holding a camera and a microphone. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto Max. "Mr. Porter?" the reporter asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded answers. Max froze, his face paling slightly. "Who are you?" "Ethan Marsh, Channel 9 News," the man replied, his tone brisk but professional. "We've been receiving reports of a situation here involving discrimination against a veteran. Care to comment?" The room went silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack watched from his table, his expression unreadable. Sam leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed as he exchanged a knowing look with one of his companions. Max stammered, his words tripping over each other. I don't know what you're talking about. This is all a misunderstanding." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his microphone inching closer to Max's face. "A misunderstanding that multiple witnesses have recorded and posted online? Care to elaborate?" The phone on the counter buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a flood of new notifications. Max glanced at it, his shoulders slumping slightly as he realized the scope of the fallout. His troubles were only beginning. The fallout from the incident at Oakside Eatery spread like wildfire. Within hours of the videos being posted, the local news stations picked up the story, running headlines like, Veteran refused service at local restaurant, and Oakside Eatery faces backlash after discrimination incident. By the next morning, the once busy Oakside Eatery was eerily quiet. The usual stream of Sunday diners, families, and regulars had dwindled to a trickle. Max stood behind the counter, staring at the empty tables with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. His staff, who had grown accustomed to bustling shifts, now stood awkwardly by the kitchen, whispering among themselves. The backlash was relentless. Protesters gathered outside the restaurant, holding signs that read, "Veterans deserve respect," and "Say no to discrimination." Many of them were community members who had seen the videos and were appalled by what they witnessed. Among the protesters were local veterans, their uniforms or military caps a silent testament to their solidarity with Jack. Sam and his group of bikers were among the first to join the protests. They stood at the forefront, their presence commanding and impossible to ignore. Sam himself held a simple sign that read, "Justice for Jack," in bold, black letters. Their stance was peaceful but firm, a direct challenge to Max's actions. For every passerby who honked in support of the protesters, there were a few who muttered angrily or refused to make eye contact. The divide within the community was stark. Some locals tried to defend Max, claiming his actions were being blown out of proportion, but their voices were drowned out by the growing tide of outrage. Inside the restaurant, Max paced nervously, his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. The reviews on Oakside Eatery's online pages had plummeted overnight, with comments like, "This place is a disgrace to our community, never coming back." "Refusing service to a veteran? Absolutely shameful. I hope this business shuts down for good." Max slammed his phone down on the counter, his hands trembling with rage. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "All over one little misunderstanding?" One of his waitresses, Lily, hesitated near the counter, her expression conflicted. She had been at the center of the incident, watching it unfold helplessly, and the guilt had weighed heavily on her since. "Maybe," she began softly, her voice trembling, "maybe if you apologized, things wouldn't have gotten this bad." Max whirled around, his eyes narrowing. "Apologize? For what? For running my business the way I see fit? No, this is their fault." He jabbed a finger toward the window where the protesters stood resolutely. "They're the ones ruining everything." Lily flinched, stepping back as Max's tirade continued. She glanced toward the door, her heart sinking as she saw the protesters holding their signs, their resolve unwavering. Deep down, she knew Max's stubbornness would only make things worse. Over the next week, Oakside Eatery's fortunes plummeted further. The restaurant, once a bustling hub of activity, was now a ghost town. Even those who supported Max seemed hesitant to be seen dining there, fearing public backlash. Deliveries were canceled, suppliers grew distant, and the staff's hours were cut as the restaurant's income dried up. Max's attempts to spin the situation in his favor only backfired. In interviews, he came across as defensive and unrepentant, doubling down on his claims that he had the right to refuse service to anyone. Each soundbite only fueled the outrage, with critics labeling him as tone-deaf and unapologetic. The pressure began to take a toll on Max. His once confident demeanor faded, replaced by a haggard, frustrated man who spent more time staring at his dwindling finances than running the restaurant. Bills piled up on his desk, and his attempts to lure customers back with discounts and promotions fell flat. Meanwhile, the protests outside the restaurant grew in size and intensity. The story had attracted national attention, and reporters from larger networks began arriving in Oak Ridge to cover the controversy. Interviews with Jack, Sam, and other community members painted a picture of a town grappling with its own prejudices, and Max's role as the antagonist became cemented in the public narrative. Amid the chaos, Sam remained calm and focused. He and his group continued to lead the protests, their resolve unwavering even as the days stretched into weeks. But Sam had a larger plan brewing, one that went beyond protesting outside Oakside Eatery. One evening, after a long day of demonstrations, Sam gathered his group at a local diner, the very one Jack used to frequent before it closed for renovations. Jack was there as well, invited by Sam to discuss what was next. Sam leaned forward in his chair, his voice low but filled with conviction. "This isn't just about shutting Max down," he said. "It's about making something better, something that stands for what's right." The bikers nodded in agreement, their faces serious. Jack, however, looked thoughtful, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "And what exactly do you have in mind, Sam?" he asked. Sam smiled faintly, the glint of a plan in his eyes. "You'll see, but I'll need your help to pull it off." Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. He had come to admire Sam's leadership and determination, but he wasn't one to jump into something without knowing the full picture. "What kind of help are we talking about?" Sam leaned back, crossing his arms. "Your story, your voice. This whole movement started because of what happened to you, Jack. If we're going to turn this into something bigger, something that lasts, we need you front and center." Jack hesitated, the weight of Sam's words settling over him. He had never sought attention or the spotlight, but he couldn't deny the impact his story had already had. He glanced around the table, seeing the determination in the faces of the men and women who had stood by him. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "What do you need me to do?" Sam grinned, his confidence contagious. "First, we're going to make sure Max knows we're not backing down. Then, we'll take things to the next level." As the meeting wrapped up, Jack stepped outside with Sam, the evening air cool and refreshing. The protests had died down for the night, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Sam placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his expression serious now. "We're going to turn this into something good," Sam said, his voice filled with conviction. "But I'll be honest with you, it won't be easy." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "Nothing worth doing ever is." Sam smiled faintly, his respect for the older man evident. "Get some rest, Jack. Tomorrow, we start the next chapter." The following day, Sam arrived outside Oakside Eatery just as the sun was rising, his boots crunching on the gravel-strewn sidewalk. The protesters hadn't gathered yet, and the street was quiet save for the faint chirping of birds. Sam stood for a moment, gazing at the restaurant's worn facade. The once bright sign above the door now looked faded, as if the weeks of tension had drained its life. He adjusted his jacket and stepped inside. Max was behind the counter, leaning over a pile of invoices and receipts. His hair was disheveled, and dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights. The sound of the door opening caused him to look up sharply, his face tightening as he saw who it was. "What do you want?" Max snapped, his voice low and hoarse. Sam didn't flinch. He walked calmly toward the counter, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from Max. "We need to talk," he said simply. Max let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? You've already done enough damage, don't you think? My business is ruined. My name is ruined. What more could you possibly want?" Sam leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "I'm not here to argue, Max. I'm here with an offer." Max's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "An offer? What kind of offer?" "We want to buy the restaurant," Sam said, his tone direct and matter-of-fact. "Me, Jack, and a few others from the community. We have a plan to turn this place into something better." Max stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Buy my restaurant? After everything you've done to run it into the ground? You've got some nerve, Davis." Sam didn't react to the jab. "You're losing money every day, Max. You've got protesters outside your door, bad reviews flooding your pages, and half the town won't step foot in here. You and I both know it's only a matter of time before you have to shut this place down." Max slammed his hand on the counter, the sound echoing in the empty restaurant. "It's my business. I built this place from the ground up. I'm not just going to hand it over to you." "I'm not asking you to hand it over," Sam said calmly. "We're offering to buy it at a fair price, enough to cover your debts and give you a clean slate to start over, somewhere else if you want." Max shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. You don't get it, do you? This place isn't just a business to me, it's my legacy. My family's name is tied to this restaurant." Sam's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "And what kind of legacy are you leaving right now, Max? One of hate and exclusion? That's what people will remember. That's what your name will stand for." Max flinched at the words, but his stubbornness refused to give way. "I don't need a lecture from you about legacies. You think you're some kind of hero, but all you've done is turn this town against me." Before Sam could respond, the door opened again, and Jack stepped inside, his steady presence filling the room. He moved slowly but with purpose, his gaze fixed on Max. Sam turned slightly, giving Jack a nod of acknowledgement. Max let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging. "Oh, great. You brought him too. What is this, some kind of intervention?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the counter and stood next to Sam, his hands resting on the edge. "Max," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "you and I both know this can't go on like this. You're digging yourself deeper into a hole you won't be able to climb out of." Max crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "And what do you know about my situation, huh? You don't know what it's like to lose everything you've worked for." Jack raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Don't I? I've lost friends, brothers, people I considered family. I've watched everything I've fought for get taken away in an instant. So don't stand there and tell me I don't know what it's like to lose." Max opened his mouth to argue but hesitated. The words caught in his throat. Jack continued, his voice softening. "Look, I get it. You built this place with your own hands. You're proud of it, and you should be. But right now, your pride is the only thing standing in the way of fixing this." "Fixing it?" Max scoffed. "And how exactly do you plan to fix this? By turning my restaurant into some kumbaya community center?" Sam leaned forward again, his voice cutting through the tension. "By turning it into a place where everyone is welcome. A place where people can come together, not be torn apart. Oakside Eatery could be that place, Max, but it's not going to happen with you running it." Max's face twisted in anger, but the weight of the words seemed to settle on him. He looked down at the counter, his hands gripping the edge as if to steady himself. The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" Max said finally, his voice quieter now. "You think you can erase everything I've done?" "We're not trying to erase anything," Jack said gently. "We're trying to build something better, something that people can be proud of." Max looked up, his eyes searching Jack's face for any sign of insincerity. For the first time, his expression wavered, the anger giving way to something more fragile. "And what happens to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do?" "You start over," Sam said. "We're giving you a chance to walk away with your dignity intact. Take the money, clear your debts, and start fresh somewhere else. It's more than fair." Max sat back in his chair, his gaze unfocused as he stared at the empty tables around him. The weight of his failures seemed to press down on him, his pride battling with the reality of his situation. He rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. "I need time to think," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. Sam stood, his expression firm but not unkind. "Take the time you need. But let me be clear, Max. This offer won't last forever. If you don't take it, the protests will continue, the bad press will keep rolling in, and this place will go under. It's your choice." Jack nodded, his eyes steady as he looked at Max. "You've got a chance here to make things right. Don't waste it." As Sam and Jack turned to leave, the weight of the ultimatum hung heavily in the air. Max watched them go, his expression a mix of anger, fear, and something else, perhaps the first flicker of doubt in his resolve. The door closed behind them, leaving Max alone in the silence of his crumbling empire. The next morning, Max sat in his office, staring blankly at the papers in front of him. The offer Sam and his group had presented lay on his desk, alongside the mounting bills and overdue notices that had become his constant companions over the past few weeks. His business was on the brink, and deep down he knew there was no recovering from the damage. The protests outside continued to grow. The online backlash had shown no signs of slowing down, and his regulars had all but disappeared. For hours, Max sat in silence, his thoughts swirling. His pride screamed at him to hold on, to refuse the offer and cling to what little control he had left. But reality whispered a harsher truth. The Oakside Eatery was no longer his refuge, his pride, or his legacy. It was now a symbol of division, and he couldn't outrun the consequences. By midday, Max finally reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he tapped Sam's number. It rang only once before Sam answered. "Max," Sam said evenly, as though he'd been expecting the call. Max sighed heavily, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "I'll sell," he said, his voice low. "But I want to do it quietly. No reporters, no big spectacle." Sam's tone softened slightly. "You've made the right choice. We'll handle it from here." 2 days later, the deal was finalized. Max signed the papers in a small, quiet meeting with Sam, Jack, and a lawyer representing their group. The moment the ink dried, Max felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He handed over the keys and walked out of the restaurant for the last time, his shoulders slumped and his head down. It wasn't the exit he'd imagined for himself, but it was the only path left. As soon as Max was gone, Sam and his team wasted no time. They walked through the building, taking in the worn floors, outdated furniture, and lingering tension in the air. Sam clapped his hands together, a determined smile spreading across his face. "Time to get to work," he said. Word spread quickly about the change in ownership, and the response from the community was immediate. Volunteers from all walks of life showed up, eager to help with the transformation. Veterans, families, local business owners, and even some of the protesters who had stood outside the eatery joined forces, bringing tools, paint, and supplies to turn the space into something entirely new. Renovations began that very week. The old sign bearing the name Oakside Eatery was taken down, and a temporary banner reading "Future Home of the Unity Table" was hung in its place. Inside, the walls were stripped and repainted with warm, inviting colors. The mismatched furniture was replaced with handcrafted tables and chairs donated by local carpenters. Sam's vision for the space extended far beyond aesthetics. He wanted the Unity Table to reflect its name, a place where anyone and everyone would feel welcome. One wall was dedicated to photographs and memorabilia celebrating the town's diverse history, from its military veterans to its local heroes. Another featured artwork from local students, depicting themes of inclusion, unity, and hope. Jack had a special role in the transformation. His military ID, the same one he'd placed on the table during the confrontation, was framed and hung in a prominent spot near the entrance, accompanied by a plaque that read, "In honor of those who serve and the strength to stand up for what's right." As the renovations continued, the community's excitement grew. People stopped by daily to peek through the windows, marveling at the changes. Local media covered the story, highlighting the collaboration between the bikers, veterans, and townsfolk to turn the restaurant into a beacon of unity. For Sam and his group, the work was about more than just rebuilding a business. It was about setting an example, showing that even in a town divided by prejudice, people could come together to create something better. Jack often found himself working alongside Sam, sanding tables or hanging pictures. The two men shared quiet conversations, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. One afternoon, as they worked on installing the new sign outside, Jack paused to admire the bold lettering of the name, the Unity Table. He turned to Sam, a small smile playing on his lips. "Never thought I'd see something like this come out of all that mess," Jack said. Sam nodded, leaning on a ladder. "Sometimes, the best things come out of the worst situations. You just have to be willing to fight for them." By the time the renovations were complete, the restaurant was unrecognizable. The once divisive space had been transformed into a warm, welcoming hub that radiated inclusivity. The finishing touch was a mural painted on the back wall, depicting hands of different colors clasped together beneath the words, "Stronger Together." When the grand reopening was announced, the town buzzed with anticipation. Flyers went up, social media posts spread like wildfire, and local news stations promised to cover the event. People who hadn't set foot in the old Oakside Eatery in years were eager to see what the Unity Table had become. On the eve of the grand reopening, Sam gathered his group in the newly finished dining area. Jack was there, seated at one of the tables that would soon be filled with patrons. Sam stood at the center of the room, looking around at the faces of those who had helped bring his vision to life. "This is more than a restaurant," Sam said, his voice carrying through the room. "It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we stand together. Tomorrow, when those doors open, we're not just serving meals. We're showing this town, and anyone who's watching, that change is possible." The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to feel the hope and pride that filled the air. He glanced toward the mural, his gaze lingering on the words painted there. "Stronger Together." As the crowd began to disperse, preparing for the big day ahead, Sam approached Jack and sat down across from him. "You ready for tomorrow?" he asked. Jack nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "I think so. It's going to be something special." "It already is," Sam said. "But just wait. Tomorrow's going to be the start of something even bigger." The doors of the Unity Table swung open at precisely 10 a.m., and a cheer erupted from the gathered crowd outside. Families, veterans, and students poured in, their faces lighting up as they stepped into the transformed space. The once divisive eatery now radiated warmth and inclusivity, with the mural of clasped hands immediately drawing attention. The vibrant colors seemed to tell the story of a town determined to mend its divides and start anew. Jack was seated at a table near the entrance, reserved just for him. Dressed in his best, with his military cap perched proudly on his head, he greeted familiar faces with a nod and a smile. Sam stood nearby, orchestrating the flow of guests and ensuring everyone felt welcome. The chatter and laughter filling the restaurant was a testament to the success of their mission. As the first official guest, Jack was given a moment of honor. Sam stepped to the center of the room, his voice cutting through the lively atmosphere. "Before we get too busy, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone very special," he began, motioning toward Jack. "This man's courage and dignity have been an inspiration to us all. Without him, the Unity Table wouldn't exist." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. Jack stood slowly, tipping his hat in thanks as his face flushed with emotion. He didn't need to say much. His quiet strength said it all. As the celebration continued, a group of former Oakside Eatery regulars entered the restaurant. Their expressions were guarded, and the air shifted slightly as they looked around. It was clear they had supported Max and were unsure of how to feel about this new chapter. A few exchanged glances, their discomfort evident. Sam noticed them immediately and approached with his characteristic calm. "Welcome to the Unity Table," he said warmly. "We're glad you're here." One of the men, an older regular with a gruff demeanor, crossed his arms. "Didn't think I'd be stepping back in here after everything," he muttered. Jack, who had been watching from his table, stood and joined Sam. "Sometimes change is hard," he said, his voice steady, "but it's also necessary. This place isn't about what it was, it's about what it can be. A place for everyone." The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, and after a long pause he nodded. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly before taking a seat. The tension dissipated, and the welcoming atmosphere prevailed. Guests mingled, conversations flowed, and meals were shared as the restaurant thrived in its first hours. Toward the end of the day, a reporter approached Jack with a camera crew in tow. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "this day must mean so much to you. What does this moment represent for you, after everything you've been through?" Jack paused, his expression thoughtful as the camera focused on him, leaving everyone eager to hear his answer. Jack sat at a quiet corner table in the Unity Table as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow through the restaurant's large windows. The buzz of the grand reopening had settled into a steady hum, with families enjoying their meals, friends laughing over coffee, and veterans sharing stories at a corner booth. Jack watched it all, a quiet smile playing on his lips. It had been a long and unexpected journey, but sitting here now, surrounded by a sea of diverse faces, he couldn't help but feel grateful. He thought about the people who had stood by him when things were at their worst. Sam and his group, the protesters, and even strangers who had reached out online to offer support. They hadn't just fought for him, they had fought for the idea that everyone deserved respect and dignity, no matter their background. He turned his gaze to Sam, who was talking with a group of volunteers near the mural. Sam caught Jack's eye and walked over, pulling out a chair to join him. "Looks like it turned out pretty well, don't you think?" Sam said, gesturing to the lively room around them. Jack nodded. "Better than I could have imagined. This place, it's not just a restaurant anymore. It's a reminder of what people can do when they stand together." Sam leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "That was always the goal. This place isn't just for meals. It's a symbol. I hope it reminds people in this town, and maybe even others watching, that change is possible. That it starts with standing up for what's right." Jack smiled. "You've done something special here, Sam. And you didn't just change a restaurant, you changed a lot of hearts." As they sat in comfortable silence, Jack's attention was drawn to a table nearby. A group of children sat together, their laughter carrying across the room. They were of different races, their hands reaching eagerly for plates of food as they chatted and shared stories like old friends. The scene was simple, yet it carried a profound message, a glimpse of the future Jack had always hoped for. Sam noticed Jack's gaze and followed it, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's why we do this," he said softly, "so the next generation won't have to fight the same battles we did." Jack nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. The Unity table had become more than just a place to eat. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to resilience, and a symbol of the change that could ripple outward from a single act of courage. As the evening wound down, Jack and Sam stood together near the entrance, watching as the last few guests lingered over their meals. Jack glanced at the mural one last time, the words "Stronger Together" etched firmly into his heart. Turning to the camera crew still capturing moments of the evening, Sam said, "If this story has inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep spreading this message. One table, one community at a time." Jack smiled, tipping his hat to the camera. "And remember, change starts with all of us."